It's wonderful to see how productive all the task forces have been and produced the communiques in 8 months. A lot of work has gone in. And in this panel, we'll discuss some of the major issues. I think what the task force focused on was how to increase the quantity of finance, reduce its price, and make sure it actually occurs, the implementation aspect, and how this can be done through public money, through private money, and through financial innovations. So the detailed points you will see in the communique are around this, around achieving these outcomes. But overall, as our compeer said, I think finance underlines all the task force topics, because unless there is finance, nothing much will happen. And yesterday, the Sherpa had also emphasized this. So I think that there is movement across successive G20s, which makes it feasible that real change will happen because of the urgency, climate change, meeting SDG goals, the huge civil society pressure that has built up for reform of the international financial architecture, and also I think a movement together of the different groups and positions. Earlier, developing economies used to emphasize development, SDG, while currently advanced economies have been talking about mitigation. But I think there's a realization that you need, that both of these go together, that development, actually, it's the poor that suffer the most when there are problems. And therefore, the positions are coming together. The other issue was that developing economies always ask for public money, but now it is about public money being used to leverage private money. And that creates opportunities for a lot of business in the other countries around the globe. So it should be a coming together which makes something more feasible, and we should actually see things happening. So I think I'll start with Professor Bambang, because he was instrumental in the Indonesia G20, was instrumental in putting reform of the international financial architecture as a topic to focus on. So how do you see the movement over this period?
Yeah. Thank you very much for being part of this panel. So let me try to evaluate what we have done in terms of MDBs reform from the T20 Indonesia last year and continuing with the T20 India this year. First, I think I'm very satisfied that you can read in our Task Force 5 communique that India already set up kind of independent expert group to advise in MDB reform. And I believe this team or this group will have close connection with the MDB reform working group under the G20. I believe under the finance track of the G20. So if that's happening, I think it's a good start. It's a good sign that there is a strong willingness from the G20 members, especially of course from the G7, to start doing the reform of the MDBs. And of course, we hope that our think tank community T20 can also have voice through the independent expert group towards the MDB working group under finance track of the G20. It looks like a long road, but I think that's maybe the best path when we try to influence the decision at the global level. I think we have to do it from the basic technical point of view, and then hopefully we'll be crawling up to the decision makers. Another thing that very important in our MDB reform is refocusing of the goal of the MDB financing itself. Of course, we have so many issues, as just mentioned, about the climate change, about the digital transformation. But remember, majority of the economy in the world categorized either as low income or lower middle income economy. and they are still struggling with the basic development issue, poverty, inequality, fulfillment of the basic services, basic infrastructure. So although MDB, of course, has to be refocusing on supporting the climate change and supporting the digital transformation and other sustainability issue, but at the same time, we need to handle the issues of the low income and lower middle income economy. And certainly, SDG is the right way to do the refocusing goal of the MDBs. So we hope that all MDBs in their operation will put SDG as their SDG financing as their main goal. And everybody knows that now effort to achieve SDG by 2030 will be very much challenging, given the fact that we had 2 years of pandemic, and then we had scarcity of financing to support SDG achievement, as well as I think the lack of the support from the developed economy to the developing economy or low-income economy in order to achieve SDG itself. So this is the best time for MDBs to refocusing their goal as institution to support SDG financing. And of course, you know very well, in all the 17 goals of SDGs, the issue of climate change is there, digital transformation is there, as well as the issue of poverty, inequality, and fulfillment of basic infrastructure and basic services. Last but not least, of course, I would like to emphasize the spirit that has been raised by the think tank community about blended financing. In order to, of course, to increase the financing capability of MDBs, of course, member countries can top up their capital. But you know very well, decision to top up the capital for MDB, you know, from the member country will be challenging. You have to go, at least in the case of Indonesia, you have to go through parliament, through all the debates, and finally, maybe you can come up with nothing. I mean, the government decide not to participate in the capital injection of the MDBs. So it's better to, rather than waiting for political decision that could be long and uncertain, why don't we go to the blended financing by involving both private capital and philanthropy and creating the new scheme of SDG financing, which is inclusive and then entertain the blended financing, and more importantly, hopefully it will be better targeted, because usually the philanthropy organization has their own target that usually reflects the basic issues that happen in certain countries.
Yeah, thank you. Riatu, you work on fiscal economics. So how do you see that MDBs can be made relevant for developing economies? Do you think we can fine-tune SDGs to come on areas where there is commonality across different groups of countries?
Thank you. I think even among emerging countries and developing countries, of course, the priorities of SDG, but usually what actually perceived as the need of developing countries, it can be different among regions, and also even within the countries, what is perceived as the importance of development, perspective of the government or perspective of the citizen. As it is said, I think in the context of developing countries, sometimes the commitment to sustainable development on the climate action needs to co-benefit as well to other development pressing issues like poverty and providing jobs, sort of the economic growth perspective. So combination of that, I think MDBs need to also align not only to the government, but also on the other stakeholders, even the private sectors. As I think Prof. Bambang also mentioned on the how is like MDBs reform is conducted, and the T20 has also initiated the external panel on this, and MDB itself has internal committee on evaluation. So it needs also to reflect on the independent evaluation group, for example, and other committee in other MDBs, and improve from that perspective and findings as well. So I think in the case of the World Bank, for example, the project disbursement is only actually 60% from the approved commitment. So it is quite an issue in terms of effectiveness when actually is it also needed to scale up the funding. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I think the MDB, we often focus on the Bretton Woods institutions, but they provide only 50% of the aggregate finance. And there are a number of other regional MDBs. And I think that there are also domestic financial institutions, and we need much more competition and collaboration to really take up the scale. So Peter, you've been associated with a lot of the reports written. Do you see movement? Do you see MDB lending really increasing in scale, reaching more people? Yeah?
Thank you, Ashima. And thanks for the whole process that we've had in this task force. So I think we should view the MDBs as a system, and the Bretton Woods institutions are part of that system. But there is, as you say, actually there's a lot more capital. 2/3 of the capital in the MDB system does not sit in the Bretton Woods, but in the other parts of that. And we have a very lively space, increasingly lively space of regional and domestic development finance institutions. So you're very right to put that question. I think, just if I could take a step back, one thing that strikes me after this year of conversations that we've had, but also the debate over the past few years, is how much convergence there is on what's actually needed. We're all very clear that the system, global finance, is failing to deliver today. There are big gaps. We have quantified these gaps. We heard Amitabh Kant yesterday, I think very powerfully making that point. But the system isn't delivering. But at the same time, there is this fairly significant degree of convergence on what is actually needed. And given the urgency of the matter, we are actually dealing with a question of political will at this point, not of the economics, not of the analysis of what's wrong and what's needed. We're dealing with the question of political will. And one of the lowest hanging fruits is the MDB system, in my view. If you look at the report by the independent expert group, N.K. Singh, Larry Summers, that came out just a couple of weeks ago, it's very clear that the MDBs can be a very big part of the solution. They're not just a marginal player. They can be a very big part of the solution. And what they require is a better use of their existing capital. And we have a range of ideas for how that might happen. They require what the report calls augmenting capital through innovations that for which there are precedents, like using hybrid capital, like using guarantee structures that can be leveraged up, like the Asian Development Bank is now exercising. They need fresh capital, and this is where you get some resistance from, especially G7 countries that feel that they will have to foot the bill. But in fact, there's a lot that can be gained for each dollar invested in these MDBs. The ability to leverage up the capital is quite significant. So there is a lot of value for money to be had. And then through helping to mobilize, catalyze private flows of capital. And there's far too little that's happening today, but we understand that the MDBs actually have the power to considerably increase. There are some very good precedents in the system for how to increase mobilization ratios, how to enable the private sector to invest with and alongside of the MDB system. So it's fairly clear what needs to happen. How do we get the political will behind it to make it happen?
Is it political will or is it changes in procedures, the board? And the board shareholders comprise largely G20 countries. If they agree and the board is behind changes, so I mean, there should be a realization that this will benefit every country. So, Amar, you have been involved in the process also and written some really widely quoted reports. You've also been talking about the necessity for investment in infrastructure. But over the years, very little has actually come forth. So now, do you think that we can have some movement, and how? This bringing in private finance, because yesterday Amitabh Kant gave the figure of $7 trillion for the globe as a whole. And he was quoting $350 trillion private money, 150 with institutional investors, pension funds, etc. So if we can bring that in, now the MDB system, if it is financed, infused with more public money, can that be used to leverage more of this coming in? Then 7 trillion seems very little compared to 150, but really tiny compared to 200 billion or whatever the MDB system is doing. So how can it be scaled up?
Thanks, Ashima. And like Hans-Peter, let me express, and all of us express our appreciation to your leadership and to Deepak, who's not here. But I did think we had a very productive year, so thank you. Thank you very much for that. So I do think that we are at a critical moment in time. India's G20 presidency comes actually at a very, very opportune time to make a big change. But it is difficult. The political economy argument is important, but there are tremendous opportunities right now. And on the scale and urgency of the challenge, so the 7 trillion that Amitabh mentioned is for the world at large, but the G7 countries don't have the difficulties of mobilizing the finance. So it's worth focusing on the finance that is necessary for emerging markets and developing countries. And in the analysis that we've done, we look at both what is needed for SDG finance, what is needed for the climate finance, and they are actually very, very interwoven. And in the report that, the recent report by Dr. N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, we argue that we need to step that up by 3 trillion by 2030. So it's a big step, but it's not an unreasonable step when you look at the possibilities. So where is this money going to come from, this additional 3 trillion? And we argue that the bulk of the financing has to come from the private sector, not because, there is failures in the public sector, but because that's where the opportunities are. And as Amitabh Kant again pointed out, there is large pools of private finance that are available that can be deployed. But in order to do that, we need 3 or 4 big pools of finance to work together. First and foremost, we need much stronger efforts on domestic resource mobilization. The bulk of the financing that we are talking about will come from domestic resource mobilization, both public and private. And at the moment, there are lots of things that I would say that need to be done in order to unlock that. Second, the MDBs are indeed the ignition key to turn the system, because they provide low-cost finance and because they operate on both sides, helping with the investments and helping with the financing. And in the numbers that put out in this report, the argument is we need to triple MDB financing in the next 10 years. We next need to create a new highway for private finance, and this is not just about blended finance, it's a completely new way now to engage with the private sector. And there are 3 parts to it: co-creation of investment opportunities, massive scaling up of risk mitigation structures, and smart deployment of blended finance. And that architecture needs to fall into place. I call it the new highway for private finance. And finally, we must not forget that we will need significant amount of concessional finance, debt-free finance, especially for poor and vulnerable countries, and especially for managing the transition. Where will that come from? That also has to be tackled, and it will come from official development assistance, but it will not be enough. So we have to think about innovative sources. That's something we emphasize very much in our task force. We have to emphasize innovative sources of new finance. So I think this agenda can come together in the Indian G20, but it can also be taken forward now through the Paris process, through the COP process. So this, I think, is indeed a critical year. And I think the topics that we have identified, I think, are indeed responding to the challenge that Amitabh set out yesterday.
Thank you. Yes, I think this issue of financing is at the heart of so much talk that is going on in different groups, and that is building up pressure. But another issue is that in the last year, we have seen issues of financial instability, financial pressures. And this used to be at the heart of what G20 was about, because it came together after the global financial crisis. But in the past few years, the idea was finance is stable, enough reform has done. And it was quiet. There was this issue was not raised in G20. But again, we are seeing, and there is a piecemeal approach. Earlier, the focus was on banks because they were regarded as the origin of tensions. Then money market functions, outflows during the pandemic, so do something there. Then pension funds in the UK. But over the past decade, we have seen a lot of volatility of flows coming in and going out with global risk on and risk off from emerging markets. And the global economic prospects tells us that 50 emerging markets grew this much lower rate compared to the previous decade. So there was a real cost there. And now it is emerging market growth which is pushing global growth. So advanced economies also suffer. So there's a necessity to protect emerging market growth. And is financial regulation an answer? Because in emerging markets, you have broader financial regulation. What happens is with the piecemeal approach that you're ignoring the basic principles that there's asymmetric information, excess volatility, that if you over-regulate one part, pressures will come out in another part. So you need macro, micro, prudential regulation for the financial sector as a whole. But the NK Singh report, I remember one sentence there, where they say that one of the tasks would be to reduce regulatory pressures in emerging markets that prevent firms coming in. So Amar, do you think that we are over-regulated, under-regulated? What can we do to reduce volatility from source countries?
So there are two sides on the regulatory issues. Well, first of all, your fundamental point, which is that emerging markets and developing countries are hit with financial instability, and that affects, it affects risk premia domestically, but it also affects the flow of private finance. I was with the largest emerging market fund in London last week, and there was a withdrawal of 20%, during this last 6 months because of financial instability that didn't have anything to do with them. So the issues of financial instability and the global architecture for financial instability does need further work, and particularly around the fact that emerging markets and developing countries do not enjoy the kind of global financial safety nets that advanced economies do. So that's one issue that I think is on the table. Second, in response to that, emerging markets and developed countries appropriately should be able to use macroprudential tools that protect them. But it doesn't completely protect them. We see that in the form of instability. On the other side, we also know that regulatory norms in the international financial markets, Basel III, INSOL, and the like, are a tremendous dampener on long-term investment into emerging markets. So that agenda also needs to be pursued. And the final part is that the alignment of finance, the issues of taxonomy, also needs to be aligned if we are to get sustained flow. So indeed, the issues of instability are very much interlinked with the issues of raising the flow of finance.
Right. I think it's a major issue which is not well understood, that this volatility actually raises the cost of borrowing, and regulation that can reduce volatility can reduce the cost of borrowing, because emerging markets, the cost is 4 to 8 times that for advanced economy because of this perception of risk. So Hans-Peter, how do you think we can have effective de-risking cost of borrowing for emerging market, apart from a repurposing of regulation, relaxing in some and tightening in some other spheres and countries? What else can happen?
Let me perhaps pick up specifically on the question of volatility, because volatility has a price. And your paper, Ashima, for the policy brief that we have is actually an excellent analysis of that. And there are some other papers about this topic. So you can put a price on volatility, in fact, on excess volatility in the currency markets. And that price then shows in the cost of capital for emerging markets in developing countries, and it becomes a big barrier to the investments that we need to happen in these countries for the SDGs and for the climate. So in the Paris summit in June, this was actually highlighted as one big issue. The World Bank, IMF, and TCX, which is a specialized fund, were asked to come up with ideas. And I know they're working on those, but the basic idea here is that because there is excess volatility in these markets, you can probably offer cheaper solutions to hedging for these at a systemic level. And what's important there, and we capture that in our task force conclusions as well, is that we find a way of pooling risk across many countries, rather than having, as we do today, sort of fragmented approaches to hedging, which end up being very expensive. But if we find a way of pooling this risk, it turns out that becomes a much lower cost than the markets expect today. And that could be quite an important contribution to a more stable guidance on expectations in these markets and bring down the cost of capital.
Yes, absolutely. I think if you look at the data, then emerging markets, the perception, the kind of risk premium built in, you don't actually see that level of depreciation. And over time, there should be appreciation as their growth rises in their currencies. So in Indonesia really suffered from outflows of capital during the taper tantrum. And now I think we're running out of time. So 2 minutes each, if you would like to pick on some issues. Riatu, first you. Some issues on how Indonesia suffered from outflows and what can make a difference in reduce this kind of volatility.
Thank you. I think in the case of global financial crisis, the taper tantrum, there is not flow from Indonesia, but it's actually manageable still, given that I think we have also experienced before a much larger crisis of the ASEAN financial crisis. So the coordination between the central bank and the fiscal policies is quite close on the ensuring the stability of macro and micro prudential as well. And I think in that context, in terms of macro indicators, we are not much. Even the financial sectors, there's an issue of the systemic risks of banking, but there is now an institutions that also managing that. So I think the policy making have learned also from the past, although there is political issues still manageable at that time. Thank you.
Yes, that is a very important point, that you need to improve domestic policies as well as global safety nets as well as regulation. Bambang?
Yeah, just like to emphasize that the good thing about Indonesia macroeconomic management is we always put macroeconomic stability is our top priority. So at least it helps when there is a global issue like the high interest rate, possible outflow. But because of the stability, because we emphasize on the stability, then the impact still can be mitigated by our domestic policy. For the domestic policy itself, I think Indonesia still needs what we call financial sector deepening in order to attract more inflow and reduce the outflow. Because, for example, now our debt to GDP is still considerably low for economy like Indonesia, but our loan to deposit ratio is already close to 100%. So it means that we need financial sector deepening in order to enhance our stability when it comes to dealing with the potential outflow because of the high interest rate everywhere.
Right. I think in India, the experience is that you need financial deepening, but you need to go slowly and develop different parts of the market. If any one part is there too much of inflows, domestic market is relatively low, that leads to problems. Now we need questions from the floor also. So what I'm going to do is pose one question, and then which is about how can G20 make finance fit for purpose ultimately. And my own answer is that we need to focus on both inclusion and innovation and the kind of technological change, the improved data. One reason emerging markets have more volatility is there's less information about them. But this is the big data age, and I think institutions that make more data available can help reduce and also create inclusion because there's more data on emerging markets. So this question, I will ask each of you to sort of finally your closing remarks, and then we'll ask for questions from the floor. And you can please introduce yourself and say whom your question is addressed to. Yeah.
My name is Kiran. I work in the Center for Health Diplomacy, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. My question is for Professor Hans Peter. So, does criteria like capital adequacy or lending ratios influence the lending decisions of MDBs? If they do, to what extent?
Okay, thank you. We'll collect some questions. Yeah.
I'm Dinkar Srivastava from Vivekananda International Foundation. My question is for Dr. Amar Bhattacharya. As you sir rightly pointed out, that the bulk of the resources for energy transition will have to come from domestic sources. That's the case with India. Renewable, I think, $10 billion over 20 years period was the Indian investment, and the FDI was just $350 million, which is not even a drop in the bucket. Now the issue is, and I wonder if there are studies available, it's not simply the question of risk perception. I don't think there are very high risks associated with Indian economy. The issue is what will the private equity or lending will come if there's profitability, which will come only if the tariffs go up. So, and if the tariffs don't go up, because many of these countries, developed and developing countries, electricity sector, power sector is heavily regulated, then there will be no money. We can talk of, $350 trillion, but that money will come only when there is a capacity to absorb higher tariff. So I would like to have your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Nagesh.
Thank you, Ashima. I think it was a very interesting discussion on finance, and I really enjoyed all of these points made. My question is directed to Amar, who mentioned that we need innovative financing solutions. And also he mentioned about the instability hedge its cost, and that needs to be reduced. So among the innovative solutions, what are the key areas, Amar, you think which should be considered. And in particular, your thoughts about the international financial transactions tax, which, as you know, has been around for a while. And some recent estimates that we have made suggest that very small marginal tax could yield some $650 billion of revenue every year, hurting no one. And it also helps in reducing or bringing down the volatility of exchange markets and capital markets. So your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question.
Thank you. I'm Asanori from the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasaka Peace Foundation. Yesterday, this financial disclosure was mentioned, and I just wondered how you see the way of improving the quality of investment and whether the countries like India or G7, G20 members may have a way to enhance the financial disclosures on, for instance, climate or biodiversity that the OECD countries have been now promoting. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll start with Amar, if you would like to, and we'll come down. Each of you take 1 minute each.
So very quickly, from colleague from Vivekananda Institute, would absolutely agree that you will not attract the private investment unless there's certitude of revenues, which are so crucially linked, of course, with offtake risk and tariffs. So we need to create, in some sense, long-term commitments on the basis of which we can get long-term finance. There's no other solution. And what we are pushing for are platforms on which we can get that kind of a commitment and on which flows of finance can happen. They are being called just energy transition partnerships. South Africa has a similar kind of problem, where the utility needs to be reformed and provide that guarantee. Here we have the issue of discoms. In Indonesia, there's issues around PLN. So it's a common issue across countries that has to be tackled if we are to get that scale of energy transition. But what we want to do is create an incentive structure for countries to actually be able to tackle it. It's complex in India, given that this is a state issue, but it can be done. So that commitment has to come, and with it, then private flow of finance will come. Second, on Nagesh's questions of innovative finance. So yes, financial transactions tax. Actually, France has pushed this very strongly, as you know, and the US and the UK have blocked it equally strongly. So we do not have an agreement on this internationally for the longest time. Yes, it has great potential, and I hope that you will continue to press it, but the politics is still not yet ripe. So there are other areas where the politics are ripe, and I'll just give a quick listing of those areas. So I do think that we have good potential for better utilization of SDRs, and it is happening because it's creating a lot of low-cost finance. We have scope for compliant and voluntary carbon markets to provide quite a lot of resources, especially for priority needs such as loss and damage. Equally, debt swaps, debt for nature, debt for climate swaps. And in Paris, the one issue that is innovative, but that also tackles directly the climate aspect, is global taxes on sectors that are relatively untaxed, especially aviation and shipping. So in my view, we have to look at all of the options given the scale and the urgency. Let me stop there. I'll give my
Thank you.
We came out last year with a report for the G20 on capital adequacy frameworks, which is now kind of working its way through the MDBs. And you're totally right. There's a lot of potential in adjusting the way MDBs approach their capital adequacy. Our estimate that we put into the new report, the one by Dr. Singh and Larry Summers, is that you can probably gain something on the order of $40 billion in annual lending capacity out of the MDB system on a base of 100, so a 40% increase by improving the efficiency with which capital is being utilized. by the MDBs. And that's a great deal, of course. There are other innovations, just to add to this, that is also worth looking at for the MDBs themselves. The MDBs today, especially the public sector, the sovereign MDBs, they lend and then they hold these assets for sometimes 20, 25 years. IDA holds them for 40 years. By speeding up the turnover of this, their balance sheets, by selling the risk on their balance sheets, let's say after 4 or 5 years, when in infrastructure, the construction risk, which is the highest risk phase, is over, but then selling it to parties that are willing to take the more stable performance risks of operating assets, that would considerably increase the lending capacity of the MDBs. So there's a very low-hanging fruit that can be gained.
Thank you. Riatu, you'd like to conclude?
Okay, thank you. I think for the case of like financing options, of course, it is important as well for the emerging countries on domestic resource mobilization. But to track investment, many of developing and emerging countries also providing and offer quite large of tax incentive. And in this case, more assess and evaluating the effectiveness of tax incentive, and maybe linking to more whether the investment is actually supporting SDGs can be a way of making not quite reducing potential loss of the tax revenue, but at the same time can also benefiting the emerging market with attracting good investment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think the goal of MDB reform in general is enhancement and improvement of development financing. So that's why I prefer to have the kind of the solution for MDB reform with the main theme is mainstreaming blended financing, because it hasn't happened. I mean, we have discussed a lot about that, but it hasn't really happened in the reality. And this mainstreaming blended finance has to be supported first by refocusing of the development financing goal, which is SDG financing. Second, by optimizing the role of MDB, especially on the risk insurance and private financing. World Bank, for example, already has MIGA and IFC to doing that. And now the question is, can they scale up, massively on those two areas? Last but not least, of course, the needs for the consortium of development financing. So any single MDB cannot solve the development financing need of a country or even a single country. So for a single country, then there is also a need for the consortium among the MDBs, between MDBs and also the bilateral development agency, plus of course private sector, philanthropy. So at the end, then we trying to solve the issue of a country rather than just thinking about whether any single MDBs can fulfill their own program. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is very, very important. The country view for the country as a whole, country plan that a contestable system of MDBs tries to fulfill. But I think the questions here were about capacity in emerging markets. So just to give an example of this debt for nature swaps, this requires money to come in for maintaining the environment, but it requires much improvement and measurement on the part of emerging markets. So it's both parties. This is the coming together, that everyone has to contribute and everybody benefits from some of these innovations. And for blended finance, the new thing is blended in programs or investment, where a number of different parties come in and they have different kinds of risks. So the risk allocation is such that returns are better, costs fall, and this whole thing can and should be scaled up. We hopefully should see that happen over the next few years. Thank you. A big hand for the panel, some excellent points.